It's 5:04 and welcome into a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. We start off this morning with attention at Capitol Hill, as we are just one day, by the end of the day today, the government is set to shut down. The GOP-controlled House of Representatives yesterday rejected a revamped spending bill, increasing the risk of a government shutdown at midnight tonight. The bill that was backed by President-elect Donald Trump and key allies failed to secure the required two-thirds majority under the suspension of the rules in the House, with 172 Republicans and 2 Democrats voting in favor, while 38 Republicans joined the majority of Democrats in opposition. Key opposition stemmed from the bill's proposed 2-year extension of the debt ceiling suspension beyond the current expiration, which is scheduled in January of next year. 2025. Despite criticism, House Speaker Mike Johnson defended the measure, asserting it would not hinder efforts for future budget cuts. The initial bill that was introduced on Wednesday was a whopping 1,547 pages that was set to keep the government open until March. That was negotiated between the GOP-led House and Democrat-controlled Senate. After Trump, Vance, Elon Musk, Vivek Ramaswamy all got involved, that bill was later reduced to 116 pages. That was after, of course, that significant backlash. The revised deal proposed a 3-month continuing resolution, a 2-year debt ceiling suspension, and it did include $110 billion in disaster relief. That would have been for portions of western North Carolina, western Florida that were dealing with the impacts from Hurricane Helene and Milton. With that, however, Republicans and Democrats in the House of Representatives were not on board for that legislation. And while today is the final day as lawmakers gathered once again, the bill failed probably around 7 o'clock or so last night. After that, it was back to the drawing board in checking some social media chatter and activity this morning. It does appear that lawmakers were once again there late into the night last night, the early hours of this morning, trying to work out a deal. And, well, they're going to have to work out a deal today, or a partial government shutdown will take place at midnight. We'll keep an eye on that over the next hour or so, let you know if anything comes down the pike in regards to that. And, of course, all of the great WBT hosts throughout the day will be following that right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. We are in the waning days of the Roy Cooper administration. He, of course, termed out as Democrat governor here in North Carolina. Earlier this week, he gave a final farewell address, at least in his current office as governor, to residents and supporters here in North Carolina. To get some additional details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome back the editor-in-chief of CarolinaJournal.com, Donna King, to the News Hour this morning. Governor Roy Cooper is a very popular figure in the state, Donna. He's won re-election twice for governor. He was the AG for many years before that. Give us a little summary of what we heard from the governor earlier this week.
Yes, of course. Well, Governor Roy Cooper, this really wraps up almost 40 years of being in elected public service in North Carolina. So he was, of course, 2 terms as North Carolina's governor, 16 years as Attorney General in North Carolina. Before that, he was in the North Carolina Senate for a decade. Before that, he was in the House for, I believe, 4 years. So he really has spent his entire career in elected state government service. So certainly he has a passion for North Carolina. He feels strongly about its success and where to take it. I thought it was interesting what he decided were his 2 big takeaways, actually, from 2 terms in the governor's mansion. He was focused very heavily on the success of getting Medicaid expanded, adding 600,000 able-bodied working age adults to the Medicaid entitlement program. And then also all the effort that he's put into what he calls the green economy in North Carolina, which is, millions and millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars in tax rebates and tax credits and incentives and all these things to bring electric vehicle charging manufacturing, battery, that kind of what he calls the green economy in North Carolina. So those two things were the big takeaways from his speech, his farewell speech on Wednesday.
Before we get into those takeaways, it's interesting that he opened up talking about him first getting into the governor's mansion back in 2017. It took no time for him to talk about HB2, Donna, and how the state was seemingly crumbling to pieces. And then it was Governor Roy Cooper that kind of corrected us and gave us a proper face again on the national stage. He didn't necessarily shy away from getting some blows in on Republicans, specifically dealing with HB2.
Oh, no question about it. He just launched his speech that he was standing, in his words, standing in the rubble of HB2. Now, if you were not around in North Carolina, I think a lot of us have PTSD from that time period, certainly. HB2 was a piece of legislation passed by the North Carolina General Assembly that said local municipalities could not set their own local rules on whether biological men can use the changing and bathroom facilities that are designated from biological women. So it didn't. There was a lot of misconception about it. It didn't say biological men couldn't use the bathroom of your choice. What it said is that local municipalities could not set their own rules. So it went like wildfire. And this became an extremely politically polarizing issue right about the time that Governor Roy Cooper took office. So a lot of folks have said that this is the reason he won that race against Pat McCrory, who was the Republican incumbent at the time. But certainly this was the core issue to Cooper as he started this speech on Wednesday, saying, look what we've done. We've brought all this business back to North Carolina. We've done all of these things, and it started when I was standing in the rubble of HB2. This was all at Nash County Community College near his hometown.
Let's continue on what some of the comments were from the governor. Obviously, I don't think if you had talked to the governor back in 2017 and asked him if he thought Medicaid expansion would happen, he probably would have honestly told you no, as Republicans had rallied against it for nearly a decade around that period of time. Yet he did get his wish back just a couple of years ago, Donna. Republicans seemingly completely flipping on something they were adamantly against for almost a decade.
Well, I think there's a couple of things. One, he vetoed budget after budget after budget, all that had raises for state employees, raises for public school teachers. He really held North Carolina's budget process hostage during that time because we just could not get a budget passed because he kept vetoing them, particularly when we did not have a veto-proof majority among Republicans. So many raises for state employees, so many raises for public school teachers, all vetoed because the North Carolina Republican-led General Assembly would not expand Medicaid. Primarily, they say because down the road, you're hamstringing future General Assemblies for what inevitably was going to blow a giant hole in North Carolina's state budget. It wasn't until the Biden administration started handing out billions of dollars in incentives to try and temporarily cover the gap. We don't know what's going to happen long term with our budget. I mean, we know that we added 600,000 people already who are working age and able-bodied, because that means they're not on another plan, to North Carolina's healthcare system. But we haven't increased access. Certificate of need laws are still in place. There's all kinds of things that have taken an overcrowded system and put 600,000 more people in it. So this story is not over, even though he's saying his farewell address.
We'll talk about the green energy economy, plus what might be next for former Governor Roy Cooper coming up after this. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:13, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. It's time for a look at traffic on this Friday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. Good Friday.
1110 and 99.3 WBT.
Good morning again. It's 5:20. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT. Hey, coming up a little bit later on today, if you are a fan of the State Lines television program, which runs on PBS North Carolina, I'll be making my way up to Raleigh a little bit later on today and recording that. So hopefully you'll join me for that. It's State Lines, PBS North Carolina, 8:30 tonight across your various television services. That's the State Lines program. You can also watch it on their website as well, pbsnc.org. Taking a look at some statewide news this morning, the campaign of outgoing Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson paid $35,000 worth of fines to settle allegations of campaign finance violations stemming from his 2020 lieutenant governor's race. The audit was sparked by a 2021 complaint filed by longtime North Carolina campaign finance watchdog Bob Hall. In his complaint, Hall examined spending by the Robinson campaign from July of 2019 through the end of 2020. Hall alleged that tens of thousands of dollars in donations and expenditures by the Robinson Lieutenant Governor campaign appeared to violate state campaign finance law, including allegations of contributions in excess of 2020 limits, unverified donors, and cash withdrawals from campaign accounts. With that, the Robinson campaign agreed to pay $35,065.52 to settle the allegations. The settlement was reached December the 6th. Hall says he was notified by the state election board of those made payments back on December the 10th. The statement also released the campaign from having to pay for the investigation or having to file amended campaign finance reports for that period. Again, they're 4 years ago at this point. Robinson's campaign spokesman Matt Hurley said the settlements resolve, quote, filing errors inadvertently made by a treasurer who has not been with the campaign in many years, end quote. Hall said it was unfortunate it took so many years to finish the investigation, adding that the public should have known the scope of these allegations well before the 2024 election. In the past, the results of campaign finance audits would have been public record, but changes made by state lawmakers in 2018 kept such investigations confidential. Hall said it was unfortunate that the Robinson campaign wasn't forced to pay for the cost of the investigation. He said, quote, the State Board of Elections is woefully understaffed and underfinanced. Quote, the General Assembly leaders have refused to provide the resources necessary to monitor the rapidly increasing volume of private money influencing public elections. This is a typical quote you hear from Democrats all across the state, constantly talking about how there's not enough money for the State Board of Elections. Meanwhile, the State Board of Elections, just like every other government agency, continues to be funded at the same or higher levels than previous years. Spending and funding has not been cut to really any of these organizations nearly across the entire state of North Carolina. I'll also note all local Board of Elections are funded in part by their county commissioners, and it is, again, something that you hear resonate in Democrat circles from all the way from the Tennessee border to the Atlantic Ocean. So that is one of the stories that we are tracking this morning. Mark Robinson paying a $35,000 fine, I should say his campaign, for his lieutenant governor race back in 2020. It's now 5:24, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We are continuing our discussion this morning with Donna King from CarolinaJournal.com about Governor Roy Cooper's farewell address that he gave earlier this week over at Nash County Community College. And Donna, as we already talked about, Medicaid expansion was something that the governor wanted, and he was successful in getting that. This green energy economy, while he's, I guess, had some wins, it's still very much in limbo, and I guess maybe some discussions at the federal level could stop some of these future aspirations and wishes, not only of Cooper, but probably incoming Democrat Governor Josh Stein.
Sure. Well, one of the things that we do know about Josh Stein is that philosophically, he probably will lean a little more left, but he's also doesn't have the deep-rooted connections, sort of that energy level killer instinct that Cooper has. So I'm interested to see how he's going to bring in what his Josh Stein administration is going to look like. He also has more current active relationships with people in the North Carolina General Assembly. Roy Cooper 2 terms as governor, but 16 years as attorney general. So when he had a poor working relationship with the General Assembly, he didn't know the people that were there. He didn't work with them the way Josh Stein did. Now, certainly Josh Stein is a Democrat, so most of his peers are going to be on the Democratic side. I'm interested to see what that looks like. Now, this green economy that you talked about, Governor Cooper has spent a lot of time and taxpayer money focusing on bringing manufacturing here for things like EV battery chargers, for EV batteries for cars, EV car manufacturing, all kinds of things like that he calls part of the green economy. It's a lot of money. We've had, $700 million has gone in infrastructure, in tax credits, all that to VinFast. There's an article up now on CarolinaJournal.com about this really struggling car manufacturer supposed to be building in Chatham County, and there's been a lot of taxpayer money that's headed that direction. So what this looks like in the long term is really going to tell us whether this really was a truly successful Cooper administration goal. What does a green economy look like? How much does it really going to cost us? And are we better off taking all those millions of dollars and just reducing taxes for everybody rather than choosing the industry that we think is going to win?
Well, and even outside of the green energy economy, green energy was a big push for the governor, constantly harping on solar and offshore wind. We've seen that kind of ebb and flow, more solar than offshore wind so far in the state. Donna, I have a suspicion that maybe some of the federal and national conversations about that is going to make that hard to go forward over the next couple of years with the Trump administration.
Absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we've said. Certainly, everybody wants a clean environment. Everybody wants low cost, plentiful energy. Now, is that going to come from solar and wind? I mean, statistically, the science just isn't there. It's not going to come from that. It's going to come from hardening our grid, making it more reliable, making it more cost efficient energy. That's really where it's going to come from. And that's one of the problems we've had with recruiting, truthfully, is that a lot of these data centers and some of these groups coming in who maybe aren't one of Roy Cooper's chosen industry manufacturers, they're coming in and saying, we'd like to build a factory, but we don't know we can get the amount of energy that we need from your grid. So that's something that Josh Stein certainly is going to have to worry about, and Donald Trump.
All right, Donna, I'm going to ask you to shake your Christmas snow globe. And did we get anything from the governor as to whether he is done with his lengthy career in public service? Do we have any idea what might be some next steps for outgoing Governor Roy Cooper?
Sure. Well, I mean, I have to note, on Wednesday when he was speaking at Nash County Community College, he said, "I'm not done." And that says it all, I think. I think he really is not done. He's 67 years old. He's got a lot of influence. He's got a tremendous fundraising ability. And truthfully, whether you're policy-wise, ideologically, opposed or in step with the governor, he's maintained a pretty high approval rating. The only time we really saw it dip was during COVID, when North Carolina's public schools and public spaces were shut down well beyond our neighbors in an extended emergency order. So that's the only time he really struggled with approval rating. 48% approval rating in North Carolina, even when only 33% of North Carolinians thought we were headed in the right direction. So there's some rumors that he might perhaps run against Thom Tillis for his seat in 2026. But I've been covering him long enough to know that he stays pretty quiet about this. When he was going to run for governor as attorney general, he was very quiet about it. He did not make a lot of public announcements early. I would expect that it's going to feel like it comes out of left field when he finally does make a decision.
And this could be a big issue for Senator Tillis. Not only is he going to be facing severe primary opponents in all likelihood from the Republican side of the aisle, whether you as you mentioned, like Roy Cooper or not, he's an incredibly popular figure in the state. And Senator Tillis had a tough re-election back just a couple of years ago against somebody that definitely did not have the name ID anywhere near what Roy Cooper currently has.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. I think that Tillis has struggled with some of the Republican base who think perhaps he reaches across the aisle too much, that he's not as firm in his most conservative values. I think he would disagree with that. I think he considers himself somebody who makes it happen, and maybe that there needs to be more people working across the aisle a little bit. I do think that Tillis has a bit of an upstream. He's already said that there's not going to be a blank check there for Trump appointment approvals from him or most of the folks that he's talking about there. But that said, he does have a lot of support, and he's been effective in that role. And a Cooper Tillis face off there in the election is going to be, at a minimum, extremely expensive.
And it's something that we'll continue to track. You can read more on Donna's story and actually check out Roy Cooper's entire farewell address by visiting our website, carolinajournal.com. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Another look at traffic on your Friday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And then
It's 5:37 now. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. We are streaming live on our Carolina Journal YouTube channel this morning as well. You can check out our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tap that subscribe or follow button, and you'll get a new program delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. We've got a series of articles that are going to be going out between Christmas and New Year's over at carolinajournal.com. They're called Waste Watch, and they cover a variety of state and federal topics in which there is a plethora of waste. And we'll kick off that series this morning with an article from our friend Katie Zender at carolinajournal.com talking about federal waste and inefficiency in IT management. The federal government wastes billions of dollars of taxpayer dollars annually due to mismanagement, project delays, and monopolistic practices in software procurement. Senator Jody Ernst from Iowa addressed these issues in a letter to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy. They are both co-chairs of the Department of Government Efficiency, also known as DOGE, urging the adoption of private sector management principles and fostering competitive markets for government software. Listen to this. Federal agencies have spent $2 trillion on IT since 1994, with $300 billion of that going to commercial software. Annual maintenance costs reach a whopping $15 billion a year, much of which benefits a few dominant companies. Reports highlight significant insufficiencies such as costly licensing fees, restrictive vendor practices, and unnecessary expenses during the migration to cloud services. Breaking vendor monopolies could save between $500 and $750 million a year within the federal government. A 2015 Government Accountability Office report revealed that programs with established baseline cost significantly less and face fewer delays than those without them, underscoring the need for better oversight, obviously throughout the entire federal government, but here specifically this morning within IT management. Ernst estimates that taxpayers could save upwards of $700 billion of the nearly $7 trillion spent in the fiscal year 2024 with improved management systems. That is our first installment of Waste Watchers. We'll have a lot about that coming up over the next 2 weeks as we work through Christmas and New Year's right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:39, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Well, we are continuing to track details out of the State Board of Elections and the highly contentious race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. The North Carolina State Board of Elections filed paperwork yesterday to move State Supreme Court candidate Jefferson Griffin's latest legal complaint to federal court. The State Board of Election lawyers wrote, defendant North Carolina State Board of Election gives notice to the petitioner, that would be Griffin, that it has filed a notice of removal of the above captioned civil action from the Supreme Court of North Carolina to the U.S. State District Court of Eastern District of North Carolina. U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers already is overseeing a lawsuit that the North Carolina Democrat Party filed back earlier this month on December the 6th, dealing with some ballot challenges that Griffin addressed in his complaint filed earlier this week. Griffin does currently trail opponent incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs by 734 votes statewide in a race that has yet to be certified. I'll note that the State Board of Elections is scheduled to meet later on this afternoon to address unresolved ballot challenges from Griffin, as well as 3 Republican legislative candidates. The board already has rejected most of more than 300 protests that Griffin filed that challenged more than 60,000 ballots statewide. Griffin asked the North Carolina's highest court on Wednesday to issue an order blocking state election officials from counting unlawful ballots from the recent election, or ballots that he calls are unlawful. A board spokesman from the State Board of Elections responded to Griffin's latest complaint on Wednesday, pointing to a 43-page order that was issued on December 11th, responding to Griffin's challenges. Griffin is seeking a temporary stay before Monday from the state's highest court to give them time to consider his request for a writ of prohibition. With that, Griffin's lawyers filed a 3,992-page document Wednesday afternoon detailing his request. The stay would block state election board officials from certifying an election result favoring Riggs. It would also block a requirement that Griffin file a petition for judicial review within 10 days of the election board's decision. Griffin's court filing explained why he pursued an order beyond a temporary stay. It says, quote, Judge Griffin asks the court to exercise its power as granted by the North Carolina Constitution to supervise inferior tribunals such as the state board. Judge Griffin asks the court to issue a writ of prohibition that prohibits the State Board of Election from counting ballots cast in violation of the North Carolina statute and Constitution. The State Board has continued to issue rulings and administer our elections in violation of North Carolina law, and the board's lawlessness cannot be allowed to continue, end quote. That reading from the lawsuit. The state board is an administrative agency that has knowingly broken the law and refused to do anything about it, Griffin's lawyers argue, saying, indeed, the board has been breaking our election law for decades. This lawlessness was brought to the board's attention back in 2023, well before the 2024 general election, but the board refused to correct their errors. Griffin's court filing highlights 3 categories of election protests: voters who registered without providing a driver's license number or the last 4 digits of their social security number, as well as of voters who have never lived in North Carolina, and overseas voters who did not provide photo identification. Now, as I noted, the State Board of Elections is scheduled to meet later on this afternoon, and they're going to be dealing kind of with a separate matter. It is still protests from Griffin and those 3 Republican legislative candidates, not specifically this most recent legal challenge brought forward earlier this week. The state board did task all 100 county board of elections with addressing protests involving possible voting by felons, voters who cast votes that were cast by people who died before Election Day, and votes cast by people who had been removed from voting rolls. I'll remind you, back on December the 11th, the State Board of Elections rejected the 3 groups of protests that Griffin mentioned in his latest complaint. The Democrat majority board voted 3-2 to reject protests based on incomplete voter registration data and non-registrant voters. The board voted unanimously to reject protests involving overseas voters who did not provide proper voter ID. We have not heard anything from the state's highest court since Griffin petitioned them on Wednesday. Again, the State Board of Elections will meet a little bit later on today. You can keep up to date with that breaking news over on our website, carolinajournal.com. And of course, we'll have any pertinent details as they are relevant coming up Monday morning right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. It's now 5:45, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Time for a look at traffic on this Friday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks, Nick. Near the
Huh?
It's 5:50. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Hey, I'm going to be making my way up to Raleigh a little bit later on today to appear on the PBS statewide program called State Lines that airs at 8:30 tonight on PBS North Carolina, which you can view across the Charlotte metro area. We'll be talking about all things state and national politics. That's State Lines tonight, PBS North Carolina. Hopefully you can join me for that. If not, you can check it out on the PBS NC website and view it there. Well, we continue to track a drama and controversy in Washington, D.C., as tonight is the night, midnight tonight, the government goes into a partial government shutdown if the House and Senate are unable to pass a short-term funding bill. Before we get into some of the details of what went on last night in the House, I'd like to play a few minutes of House Speaker Mike Johnson ahead of a vote that took place around 6:30 last night.
Evening, everybody. This is Washington. This is how the lawmaking is done. It's a long process. Sometimes it takes a while to reach consensus, but we're going to do the right thing here tonight. The American Relief Act of 2024 will provide temporary funding to get us into the first part of next year. We're excited about that because Republicans will have control of the White House and the Senate and the House, and we'll be able to make the key decisions about funding for the 2025 fiscal year. So this will allow us the opportunity to do that. In addition, we're going to take care of Americans who have suffered true devastating emergencies and disasters. We had, of course, a record hurricane season with Helene and Milton that did real damage across as many as 6 states. There's $100 billion to provide much needed relief to those people, those Americans who have really been struggling and still are from those storms. And in addition to that, we have $10 billion of emergency aid to our farmers and ranchers. Many of the small farms in America are on the verge of collapse, primarily because of Bidenomics and inflation, the high cost of inputs and fertilizer and seed and everything that they need to keep those farms going. And they've had 3 lost years in a row, some of it because of drought, a lot of it because of the economics of it, and it doesn't make sense for lenders to provide them funding anymore. And so this is a stopgap measure to save those farms, to save food production in America, to ensure that we have that diversity in the marketplace and our food supply is directly related to national security. So it's a very, very important thing for both parties to do to provide that aid. We also have a clean extension of the Farm Bill, a clean extension of health extenders that are necessary, and a couple of other details. Everything that I just told you was negotiated in a bipartisan fashion. Both parties agreed to these terms, and that's what's on the floor right now. The only change in this legislation is that we are going to push the debt limit to January 30th of 2027. We will push it beyond that or to that time point, and that will allow us to do the important work of governing in the new Congress. Why does that matter? Because we are committed to cutting hundreds of billions of dollars of wasteful spending out of the federal budget. That's what we're going to do. The DOGE effort with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, the commitments that President Trump made on the campaign trail will come to fruition when we get about that very important work for the American people. The government is too big, it does too many things, and it does very few things well. We're going to cut and limit the size and scope of the government and get it under control for the American people. We have a mandate to do so. President Trump received 77 million votes in the election. House Republicans, 74.7 million votes, the most in history. We know what we are to do. We're determined to do that. And even though this vote would push the debt limit to 2027, it in no way reflects any lack of enthusiasm on our part to get about those serious cuts for the American people. We have to have fiscal responsibility as a core principle of our party. So that's what the House Republicans are committed to, every single one of them. We will get together and do that work, and it begins in early January. I hope that this vote passes tonight. We will send it to the Senate. We will extend funding, and we'll come back, and we will have the America First agenda come in roaring in January for the American people. Thank you so much.
That's House Speaker Mike Johnson, that audio and video courtesy of C-SPAN. That was ahead of a vote that took place around 6:30 last night, in which the GOP-controlled House did not do the wishes of their House Speaker. They rejected the revamped spending bill that would stop a partial federal government shutdown at midnight tonight on Friday, leaving the fate of that measure backed by President Donald Trump and his very close allies in doubt this morning and very much up in the air. Just hours after the deal was unveiled, 172 Republicans and 2 Democrats voted in favor of the legislation. It failed to pass under suspension of the rules, meaning the bill needs a 2/3 majority for it to succeed. 38 Republicans voted against the bill, and all but 2 Democrats voted against the legislation as well. As evidenced by a tense debate on the House floor last night, at least some of the Republican opposition to the spending legislation rests in how the bill will extend the suspension of the debt ceiling for another 2 years beyond January of 2025, when it is currently suspended and is slated to expire. You heard Speaker Mike Johnson talk about that. He, as you heard, he pushed back on that. Congressional leaders originally unveiled a 1,547-page bill on Wednesday that had been negotiated behind closed doors between Republicans and Democrats. That was a non-starter from day one due to major pushback on social media from President Trump and Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. That caused lawmakers to revamp the bill to just 116 pages. It does include much-needed disaster relief for Western North Carolina, like you heard the House Speaker talk about. However, there were plenty of Republicans, 38 of them, that did not vote in favor, and all but 2 Democrats voting against that legislation as well that would keep the government open. Checking out some social media traffic this morning after the failed vote last night, it does appear that House and Senate leaders were working late into the night, the early hours this morning, to try and figure out how they go forward in regards to this government shutdown. It's something that we'll continue to track throughout the day. That's going to do it for a Friday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. Have a great weekend. We're back Monday morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.